just to say, I'm absolutely delighted to be here and part of the Consortium's annual event, and as well as part of Ireland's launch of its National Action Plan. I was extremely happy to have the opportunity to work again with the Consortium this year. It's always a pleasure to do so. And as Angela had said, what I was lucky enough to be commissioned to do was a piece of research looking at ways of addressing gender-based violence in post-conflict or fragile states, with a specific focus on Sierra Leone. So what I'm going to do is just basically talk you through what we did as part of the research project, some of the findings that came out of that, and the key learning and recommendations. So here we are. Okay, so as Angela noted, this year the Consortium took a renewed focus on looking at gender-based violence in conflict-affected or fragile states. And I'll just caveat that I'm going to use terms such as conflict, post-conflict. Those terms are quite rigid in and of themselves, and we know that when a conflict ends, you don't simply draw a line in the sand and everything changes and everything is different. There are fluidity between those phases. They're very, there's linkages between them, but I'm just using those terms to facilitate the discussion today, if you like. So in order to look at this issue, the Consortium conducted a mapping exercise, basically to figure out, well, what are we doing in relation to this issue? Discovered that 9 of its members were working in Sierra Leone, and that one of the key ways to enhance its learning would be to undertake a research project to see, well, what are we doing and what can we learn from it? So there's a list there, as you can see, of the 9 members of the Consortium that are there. It's quite a unique situation, really, to find that number of agencies from one conglomerate in one place. And so it presented quite a unique opportunity. Sierra Leone itself presents an opportunity because it's a context that has experienced over 10 years of protracted conflict, during which women experienced mass and egregious forms of sexual and other forms of violence. And since the end of the conflict through the Lomé Peace Agreement in 1999, has experienced over 10 years of post-conflict transition. So when I went in and did this research, we're talking about 10 years later, and that is a significant caveat, I think, to understand about the findings of the research. One of the key things with this research was understanding that if we want to really learn about conflict-affected contexts, we need to take the focus on that specifically, rather than ordinary or wider development programming, if you like. One of the ways to do that, which the Consortium identified, was to use the OECD DAC principles on fragile states. So you have copies of that, I think. And basically, this is a set of 10 principles which the Development Assistance Committee developed as a guiding principles, if you like, for international actors who engage in fragile states. What's the best way to go about doing our development programming in such contexts? And they basically promote a differentiated approach to trying to undertake programming that is responsive to a post-conflict context. With that, and as part of the research, I also identified the relevance, of course, of the United Nations Women, Peace and Security Council resolutions, and also the fact that the Committee on CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, this year has developed a concept note with a view to developing a recommendation for the specific applicability of CEDAW to post-conflict environments. So all of those 3 together provide us with quite a concrete framework for addressing the specifics of a post-conflict environment with the specifics of the need to address gender equality considerations. Some key, I'm sorry, trying to jump through this quite quickly, yeah. Some key questions framed the research, and these were identified by the Consortium itself. Those are generally, what are the different approaches that Consortium members are using, and how do they relate to the OECD DAC principles, and what can we learn from them? The research itself then was undertaken between September and October this year, a secondary database where I reviewed all of the project documents of all of the Consortium members on the ground, and then went to Sierra Leone and spent 10 days there doing interviews with the staff of members of Consortium member agencies, as well as other wider actors there, such as the United Nations and other international and local NGOs. So let's jump onto the findings. This is the most important bit. As I said, the key question was about what kind of approaches are we using. So basically, I found 2 broader categories under which to organize the findings. The first was direct programming approaches, so specifically on GBV per se. And then the second was on mainstreaming approaches, so trying to address GBV through wider sectoral programming such as health or education. And I'm going to talk about the 2 of those individually, starting with direct programming. And again, under this, we have prevention and response, and I'll just go through those individually. Under prevention, first of all, and Jean talked us through some of the specifics around ideas of acting to prevent gender-based violence in the first place. One of the interesting things I found when I spoke to people in Sierra Leone, particularly Sierra Leoneans themselves, was they noted that before the conflict, we didn't know what GBV was. We'd never heard of it. And now that's not to say that GBV didn't exist. Of course it did. Violence is endemic to our homes, communities and societies worldwide. But they didn't understand it as a concept as this, as a rights issue. It was tolerated, it was part of life. And so that what happened during the conflict, when the mass egregious sexual violence occurred, and this became visible, and there was international responses to it, this made the wider issue of GBV more visible. And in the aftermath of conflict, then, you have this response to this issue. And so what's happening is almost like a redefining or a new meaning to this kind of violence in our lives. Suddenly women were told and were learning that we don't have to put up with this. This is a rights issue, and I can actually name this as something that's happening in my life. And some of the agencies are doing a lot of work around this. And key to this is understanding some of, I think, especially what Jean had said, that we shouldn't make assumptions that because sexual violence happens in conflict in this way, that this is what it's going to look like after conflict. Rather, we need to understand the picture of violence against women after conflict. What does it look like? Where is it happening? Who is it happening to? What are the forms of violence that are taking place? Disaggregate out the way that violence is happening and then appropriately respond to it. So ActionAid, for example, have been engaging with communities and used a very clever tool where they undertook a participatory vulnerability analysis, where they used a timeline with community members to map out the kinds of violence that they would acknowledge were in their homes and communities before, during, and after conflict. And so that meant that in the post-conflict context, they could then understand what the picture of the violence actually was and develop appropriate responses to it. And that corresponds very well with DAC principle number 1, which basically advises us to take context as the starting point, find out what's going on and respond to that appropriately. This new meaning that's been attributed to violence as a crime or as a rights issue is also important in terms of providing appropriate responses to it. The Access to Justice and Legal Centre, which is an NGO that is a partner of Trócaire, have provided a programme of legal aid to women and girls who wish to pursue legal redress. Part of that programme is that AJLC engage with the police and judiciary to enhance their skills, knowledge and responses to GBV. Okay, I'm going to have to fly through this. And that what they're trying to do is ensure that the systems are in place to respond to the kind of violences that women are experiencing. And so basically, overall, what we're talking about in prevention is understanding that awareness raising is important. You're helping people reconceptualize and understand violence, but that you also need to have the kind of systems in place to try and respond to that. Under the response area, what we have and what I saw through the research was the need for multi-level comprehensive responses, so that you have opportunities at national level, middle systems level, and at the very grassroots services level to ensure that responses are in place to address gender-based violence. One of the key issues being that in the aftermath of conflict, when a state is being rebuilt, when political reforms are taking place, is GBV being placed on the national agenda as a priority? And how can we as international actors make sure that it is? And part of that is ensuring that there are coordinated approaches taking place. An individual agency can't do everything, but that if we coordinate well together as agencies and with government, we can try and get those multi-level arenas addressed. I'm going to have to skip on through these. Mainstreaming was the second approach. And one of the key things being to understand that whatever programs we're doing, that we ensure to understand the impact of GBV on the outcomes of our programs. And one of the really good examples that I saw in Sierra Leone was Concern Worldwide's program with their partner Pinkin to Pinkin, where they have started addressing GBV through their education program because they realized that girls were dropping out of school because of sexual exploitation and abuse. And what was interesting is that as Concern were engaging with children and their families, these families were starting to report abuse. But then as they reported, they were addressing the supply end. They were approaching the police and health services, and they weren't actually equipped to address the help-seeking behaviour, if you like, on the part of communities. So a key learning was to understand that if you're going to generate demand, you also have to work at the supply end and make sure that those are there. And we have responsibilities in that respect as international actors. Just briefly then, some key summary points is around this, is that during the research it was clear that a lot of people will question, well, when does post-conflict end? When does development begin? Is there a difference? I think there certainly is some key contextual factors to take into account because of the aftermath of a conflict, and that the OECD DAC principles actually help us to think about that a little bit more succinctly, and that we can use that in our work more strongly, I think, to do that. I think there's been clear progress by the consortium itself. Certainly for me, I first got involved in 2006, I think it was, and to go out to a country and see so much happening at such an extensive level by members, I have to say was great, and I would congratulate you on that. And there's key issues here for us as international actors, and certainly for the consortium, to engage more strongly and use the Women, Peace and Security resolutions. They're there, they're key tools, use them at national level and international level for advocacy and to inform the design of your programmes. I'll just run through these very quickly. Some recommendations. You have these on the learning brief that was distributed, so you can read them there in more detail. Some of the key recommendations for me were the need for us to understand actually what is post-conflict transition about. There was a question for me whether the members of the consortium were addressing contextual factors of the conflict by default or by design. And I think we need to be doing that more by design, to understand that in order to really get at violence, what it looks like, we need to actually understand that broader context and understand the landscape of gender-based violence that actually is occurring. Identify and utilise the opportunities that may exist after conflict. After a conflict, you may have a complete rebuilding of society, new structure, new systems being put in place. What are we doing to make sure that GBV gets on the national agenda there? And let's try and work a little bit harder at that, I think. Working at multiple levels is key, and again, coordination is absolutely key and part of that. It's very important that we address both demand and supply levels, and it's important, particularly for an entity like the consortium, given the status that you're at now in terms of understanding GBV, providing leadership on this. There's space, certainly in Sierra Leone, where there was a National Coordination Committee on GBV, but there's more space to provide leadership and support government to take national leadership on that. And part of this is using tools such as the Women, Peace and Security resolutions in your advocacy strategies. So, for example, Sierra Leone has a National Action Plan in 1325. Are we using that to say to them, you have commitments on this, let's go about implementing this? Ireland now has a National Action Plan in 1325. How do we use that to meet one-on-one with a state like Sierra Leone and say, we have a mutual commitment here? How do we go about ensuring that we are all delivering on those commitments? So that's it, very briefly, sorry, but thank you.
Thank you very much. I apologise for having to hurry both speakers with such quality of content through, but we are working in a timetable where the Taoiseach is arriving and Mary has to leave. So I wanted, before the Taoiseach to arrive, for Mary to have an opportunity to respond to both the work of Jean and Aisling, and to get a sense of that before we move into the Irish NAP launch specifically. So Mary, could I ask you just to have any comments?
Okay. Thank you. Well, first of all, I echo what you said, Anya's two really very fine presentations under a lot of time pressure. So thank you to both of you. I think what I'd just like to do is pose one question to Jean and two to Aisling. While you were speaking about the lack of progress on gender-based violence at an earlier stage, I was very much reflecting on the 10th anniversary year. And I chaired or co-chaired a high-level panel, an advisory panel to the UN on 1325. And in fact, a lot of commitments were made during 2010, and particularly in October 2010. Have you tracked implementation of these? I mean, there was a website in which they're all contained, and what value do you think that has had of just having an international focus, a lot of commitments both by governments, by countries, more national action plans and so on. But is there an effective monitoring and evaluation of those commitments? And for Aisling, just 2 questions. I had been in Sierra Leone about 2 years ago, so I was really very interested to see your assessment, which I had an opportunity to look at. And just 2 points. First of all, did you make any link with Sierra Leone's own National Action Plan? Because I remember one of the things that happened while I was in Sierra Leone was actually a meeting of the Mano River countries, which was really good to talk at a regional level, Liberia, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire and Sierra Leone, and they were exchanging views. And I just wondered whether, because I didn't see it reflected in the... And the second point is the role of political leadership in a country. And I remember, because we were focused a lot on health issues at that time, that the political leadership of the president, his announcement that it was important that there would be free medical care for pregnant women, lactating mothers and children under 5, and that put huge pressure on the health system. But it was a big statement by Sierra Leone, contrary to donor advice, that Sierra Leone was a poor country and couldn't afford to do this. He said, I'm doing it. I wondered, was there any similar commitment on gender-based violence? That would just be interesting, and how you value political leadership.
Could I ask, could you just hit the microphone? Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so 1325 was groundbreaking, and we have a lot of work that's been going on in the last decade or 11 years to illustrate just how groundbreaking it was. However, there are issues of accountability in implementation of 1325, particularly as it relates to gender-based violence in pretty much every conflict-affected setting around the world. And that's why we have 1880 that really pinpoints more the issue of sexual violence in conflict. Because of this recognition that 1325 didn't give us a sufficient platform to focus on sexual violence and hold states accountable for addressing it. And now we've got 1888 and 1960, which are going to help us in this issue of accountability with monitoring the prevalence of conflict-related sexual violence around the world, and hopefully in that monitoring process to improve our capacity to address it. Okay, so all of these Security Council resolutions are promising, and they represent a shift in our consciousness about the problem of violence against women in conflict and its aftermath. But that consciousness is not necessarily reflected in the scale of programming in settings around the world. We're not there yet. We haven't matched our ideological commitment with our practical commitments in terms of the allocation of financial resources, the development of experts, the rollout of programs, et cetera. And so those are the areas that we need to continue to really focus on. Use 1325 and all of the subsequent resolutions related to women, peace, and security as an advocacy tool to move on and actually do the work on the ground.
Okay, thank you. Great, thank you for the questions. So just to take the first one in terms of linking with the Sierra Leone National Action Plan, it's certainly something I looked at as part of the research and as part of the data review before I actually went in to try and find out, well, what does Sierra Leone have in place already actually to address issues such as GBV? And they do indeed have a national action plan. And I suppose this is one of the gaps that I think came out through the research, is that as international actors, we're actually not using national policy frameworks enough to align our work with. And I think that's a key opportunity, that in the aftermath of conflict, you have this space to create new policies. Let's get those issues onto the agenda. As I said, Sierra Leone has come quite far in terms of a formal equality basis anyway, in terms of putting in place policy frameworks, but that there's space there for member agencies of the consortium to actually align their work with this. And I don't think, certainly through this piece of research, that has happened to as great a degree as it could happen. I think there's a lot of commitment and energy around the National Action Plan there at country level, but it felt to me that it was within a certain remit of organisations, so the women's movement, the women's sector. And what tends to happen is maybe we say, well, we're doing development. and that how is this relevant to what we're doing? And it's this whole question around, is this post-conflict, is it development? And so there's space there, I think, to make more linkages between the political security and development agendas, so that National Action Plans in 1325 becomes part of the broader framework of how we do what we do, if you like. And that is linked, I think, to your second question around political leadership. It was interesting when I talked with some of the, particularly the Sierra Leonean staff of the agencies, that there was a great sense that enough wasn't being done, that there wasn't enough political leadership being demonstrated by government, and that there's not the political will there to actually address it. There was a key question, and I just didn't get time to discuss it, I think, that is gender-based violence part of state building? And what the sense was that the government doesn't think it is. And we all know that the Women, Peace and Security resolutions tell us that gender equality is absolutely essential to political reform and state building after conflict. That hasn't quite happened to the degree that it could and should do in Sierra Leone. And, you know, we have to ask the question, well, are we actually coordinating and advocating effectively to make sure that that happens, whether from donor level down to NGO level, and supporting national priorities? There's a women's movement and a women's network there in Sierra Leone. How do we as international actors support their priorities and help them implement those? One key thing I did want to mention that I thought was an initiative as such was that in, I think it was 2009, the government actually came out and issued a formal apology for the levels of sexual violence against women during the conflict. And that was a huge acknowledgement of what women had suffered. And as far as I could understand in talking to people, it meant a lot. And there is a reparations programme in place which basically delivers some compensation and skills training and packages of funding to women who have come forward and identified as sexual violence survivors. One of the problems is that's not receiving the amount of funding that it needs. They've identified over 3,000 women who've come forward. As we know, that's only the women who've come forward. They've only been able to provide this reparations programme to 650 women. The other women are wondering, well, when is it my turn? And they can't get the funding. And it speaks to Jean's recommendation around, you know, committing our funding and going there with that. The government have in place a national women's machinery, which has a broad series of policy frameworks. They're just about to finish developing a national action plan on GBV. They have an action plan and a policy on gender mainstreaming. They have 3 gender laws in place, which provide a legislative framework for domestic violence and other forms of gaps in gender equality. And again, there's a policy framework there. It's a very formal piece that we have in place to support our work, but are we using it effectively? And I think we should be aligning our work more strongly with those.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Mary, do you have any other comments?
No.
Okay. Thomas is due to join us shortly. Is there any quick comments anybody would like to make? Or questions to either of our speakers? I won't be as brutal with you as I have been with them, I promise. Anybody, any comments? Okay.
Maybe just, since there isn't a comment from the floor, just to continue this conversation, Aisling, you know, you've mentioned quite a number of initiatives from the government, and yet you say that the perception is that there was a lack of political leadership on gender-based violence.
Sorry, you're right. Let me caveat that. On a formal basis, so on a formal equality basis, you have policy frameworks in place. There's a national women's machinery in place, and you know, I went there and spoke with them, and basically, Trocra, for example, have given them this year a computer and stationery. And the National Women's Machinery is in place since 1996. So you're talking 14, 15 years later, they still don't even have the resources to equip the offices to function. So while they're getting these kind of frameworks in place and they're getting probably international support to do that, there's not the level of commitment that makes sure that that women's machinery is robust and it's getting effectiveness right across government levels, and that it has been equipped with what it needs to make a difference. And it's not been given, and that needs to come through political will. And so there was a sense that, and what was really interesting actually was that there was a sense that the moment had passed. There was a moment after the conflict where you get this stuff to happen, and they'd got them in place, and now there was kind of a sense of, gender, well, actually there's other priorities now. And so it's tapering down, and so there was a sense that you need to get in at that moment, and if you don't, you're not going to keep getting the kind of resources and commitment that you want.
But at the same time, if the structures are there, is there an opportunity? Because I mean, you know, Sierra Leone is still a very poor post-conflict country, with a lot of other priorities. You know, would it be possible for the donor community to be more supportive. Because after all, these are indigenous, sustainable structures, and to try and strengthen them.
No, that's a key observation, and something that I talked to the consortium about when I was there. All of the members came together and we met on my final day. And what really struck me was that at the donor level, so in terms of distribution of responsibilities around different areas of aid, there's no gender working group among the donors. There's no key donor that is leading on gender and gender-based violence. And so we talked about the opportunity that the consortium presents. You have NGOs working themselves and with partners at very grassroots levels who understand what the issues are. You have Irish Aid, who have both a political and a development presence. What are we doing to maximise and exploit the opportunity that this collaboration of the consortium presents? So you could have a situation where the NGOs are able to transmit key messages on GBV to Irish Aid, who could then transmit them into this donor arena and communicate this in terms of national aid priorities with government. And that was just one of the recommendations we talked about out of that. So absolutely, that is a key observation, and that we should be maximising the potential that we have to bring that kind of leadership.
I think that's very helpful even to the private discussion that members of the consortium were having this morning, again under the strict chairmanship of Anya's, but because it was recognised that more work in the field is needed, and I think maybe the thought that work in the field now must involve having that gender network at field level.
Yes.
Which would be an interesting kind of development.
Sure.
There's quite
Absolutely.
a lot of potential.
Yeah.
There's a hand over there.
Joseph, sorry, I'm wearing my GAPS hat. Nice to see you again. It's just that there are other of us as well, obviously I'm from the north, who are working with other NGOs, Doctors International, for instance. So is there a way that if that coordination could come together to make sure that gender is very much to the forefront of the plans, because if they're equality proofed, if you like, in terms of moving forward, that we could also put in some of the other organisations that are working there as well, because I do think that we're not all focused enough on gender-based violence and being able to perhaps coordinate the work together, because I'm involved with some work that's going on there too, but I'm not sure that we're as focused on the issue either. So if there could be some trailing down through and some advice to us to try to make it a two-way, upwards and downwards, and make us focused.
I think you've raised a very interesting issue which links to what we'll be talking about in a moment, the launch of the National Action Plan, because it does, as I understand it, envisage precisely that kind of information and good practice sharing and positive links between women's organisations, north and south, if I could put it that way. And that's one of the strengths, actually, that there was a lot of consultation beforehand on that issue. So I think it's a very relevant one to the launch of the National Action Plan.
Okay, is anybody else? I was just going to ask Jean to have a... Was there somebody else there? Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to follow up nationally on the National Action Plan 2025, and there seems to be a disconnect, I think, in many places between policy development around 2025 and then the implementation. Of course, we're at that stage here in Ireland, and I think it would be really important to look at the implementation. So I was just wondering about the role of civil society more broadly in the development of the plan in Sierra Leone, and what efforts are being made to engage them, given that you found that there was a dearth of action around 1325 in the research.
Sure. I have to caveat that I didn't look at this specifically, but certainly, as far as I understand in terms of the development of the action plan from other pieces of work I've done, that yes, there was a civil society development and they did quite extensive consultations at country levels. There is a national coordination committee on gender-based violence where specific programming takes place. I'm not sure whether that actually discusses the action plan on 1325. What was interesting is when I spoke with the National Women's Machinery, the staff member there, incredibly committed, incredibly skilled, basically said, we have all these policy frameworks in place, but they're kind of sitting out on their own and we're not quite sure how to pull them together and do what we need to do with them. And they're actually going to get an international staff member, technical advisor in next year, they hope, to basically sit down and thread through all of these policy frameworks together and figure out how we go about implementing them. And in terms of GAP, I suppose what I mean in terms of members of the consortium as international agencies, what are we doing to actually utilise the tools and frameworks that are there already. And I think part of that, and again, this was a gap that I witnessed, is I couldn't see any linkages between what the consortium was doing and what the National Women's Network was doing. So in terms of identifying priorities identified by women and women's representatives, how are we relating our work to that? Because at the end of the day, GBV is about gender equality and women's equality. Yeah. And there's space there that, and again, it's that how do we design our programs? Are we doing it in a box, or are we looking at what national priority is, what the opportunities are, who has already identified what women want, and how are we using that in the way that we work? And I think that's key around the action plan in 1325. You have a tool there, and how are we helping government to implement its own commitments?
Okay, Jean, do you want to make anything?
Yep. Developing policies and action plans is a first step. National governments recovering from conflict, international governments, such as Ireland in this example, should be applauded for developing those action plans as a first step. But the action plans have to be institutionalized by agencies, and the agencies have to commit the human resources in order to make sure that those action plans are institutionalized. And that's where we're really seeing the gaps. I mean, so the sort of issue with Sierra Leone in terms of the ministry of not having paper or a computer to work on, those issues exist in many post-conflict settings around the world. In Southern Sudan, our newest country in the world, the Ministry of Gender similarly doesn't have the resources to implement some of the policies that are already being put in place. So agencies have to institutionalize their own strategies. Coordination bodies have to institutionalize their own strategies with indicators that can be monitored in order to support the actualization or implementation of these sorts of broader action plans.
Thank you. I promise you, Taoiseach, that we didn't plant that question so that you would hear as you come in the door.